welcome back to part 2 of Nolan Spotlights with Simon Donald, who's just flicking through
how to draw comics the Marvel way. It was a big. I got this in '78, I think it was. It was quite difficult to get a hold of because I think it was only published in America at the time. But it was the first book. Well, actually, I got a school prize. No, it wasn't '78 when I got this. It was later because I got a school prize in 1979, and you got a book token, you know.
Yeah.
And the book. Well, I got two actually. I got the woodwork prize and the form prize. And for the woodwork prize, I got the book of the two Ronnies. So it was two Ronnie scripts. And the other one, I got a book called Masters of Comic Book Art, which is very similar to this one. And it's like a kind of an instruction manual on how to draw comics, you know. And there was a guy called William Cook who wrote the official history of VIZ when we'd been going for 25 years. And he said that those two school prize books, the How to Draw Comics and Marvel, no, not this one, it was Masters of Comic Book Art and the book of the two Ronnies. He said if you could sum up VIZ in sort of two books, I'd pretty much done it with me choices, you know. It was being a comic artist in those days was like a really niche thing. Yeah. It's not like now. There's comics everywhere now, you know, with the sort of manga, but also, you know, the sort of Marvel films, and it's a huge deal now. But back then it was a really minority interest thing. You know, you were considered to be a bit strange to be even interested in comics.
It wouldn't have been on the careers teachers list of possibilities.
No. But they didn't even bother speaking to me about careers at school because I was in the knackers class, you know. So
many talented people have ended up or started from.
Yeah. Well, I didn't realise it until I was 40, but I'm dyslexic, you know. Right. So if you look at my school career, it's quite laughable now because anybody could look at it now. Yeah. And so, they say, oh, yes, a very gifted child. Oh, very creative, like, you know, very talented. And then very lazy around reading, especially around reading and writing. Never hands work in on time, you know, misspelled, all this sort of stuff. And like all of my problems always lay around reading and writing. Yeah. And nowadays, I guess I only began to suspect it myself in me sort of probably late 20s or something, you know, because I sort of heard about dyslexia because I had a friend who was dyslexic, and I kept thinking this sounds very much like.
Yeah, because when it's you don't realise you're different to anyone else, do you? Because that's just who you are.
That's right. Yeah, I just thought it was normal, and I also the sad aspect of it is that I sort of believed what I was told because these were the people who had success and the people who were in the positions of authority. You know, continued to say, well, obviously you're not trying as hard as the other kids, you know, which I felt this great feeling of injustice about that. But then I thought, but obviously they are right. And I couldn't work out what it was that I needed to do in order to do as well as the other kids. And, you know, and that stuck with me until that day that when I was diagnosed. It was like a big burden of, feeling like I was inadequate in some way. Yeah. But then as soon as I realised, I kind of went,
it must have been a huge relief.
Actually,
there's a reason for this.
And I was able to stop buying books and magazines as well, in the hope that this would be the one that I finally got around to reading, you know. And I started to buy audiobooks instead, you know. And since then, I've become terribly well read, but listened. I guess I'm well listened.
Well listened.
Oh yeah.
So the viewers can't see that you're drinking black tea. There's a reason for that. We touched on it before we started. So you've recently become dairy free, but it's had much more of an impact than you expected.
Well, yeah. So about 2 years ago, my wife decided to try being vegan, and it didn't seem like too much of a step for me because I haven't eaten meat since I was a teenager. I've always eaten fish, but never eaten meat, you know. And so, you know, I didn't like the idea of not eating cheese because I love cheese. And anyway, we tried, because I was living with her, she's trying being vegan, so I automatically, by association, became vegan. And anyway, I've been asthmatic since I was about 15. And after a couple of weeks, I turned to her one day and I says, do you know what? I says, I haven't used my relief inhaler once for ages. And I sort of worked out, hold on, it goes back to the day that I effectively stopped eating dairy. Yeah. And I suddenly became aware that like dairy has been this trigger for asthma for all these years. So I don't do it. However, I've never had milk in my tea. I've always had
that's not an unusual thing.
Well, I say never. I stopped having milk in my tea when I was about 15, I think. Yeah. But I had milk on cereal and all
of course.
That.
Well, yeah.
I mean, how am I going to put water on it? Beer.
You're not going to have dry cornflakes, are you? But because we've had a couple of our guests have said similar things, that they've become vegan for whatever reason. And, you know, it's uncovered all sorts.
Well, I'm ignoring the biscuits as well.
I'm sorry. Well, I did ask, and because obviously it's your
well,
choice,
I can't do wheat anymore.
Right. So that was a terrible choice, really, wasn't it?
But that's nothing to do with the vegan thing. That's I'm on a medication that affects your digestive system, and I've probably had a slight intolerance to wheat all my life, but this thing makes it a lot worse. So I found that giving up wheat is just end of the problem. So but I can't eat biscuits. I've got to buy the very expensive gluten-free ones. You know?
Oh, they are full of gluten, so we'll leave them there.
Although Crimbles Crimbles are naturally
really
gluten-free because they're just coconut,
right.
and sugar.
They sound lovely. I've never had one of them.
Oh, they're good.
Maybe we'll get some next time.
Aye.
Anyway, enough about biscuits. So you left us on the brink of a new phase, really.
Yes. Yeah.
So the program I got out of the BBC, a couple of important people who turned out to be important had seen it.
Yeah.
One of whom you mentioned before.
Yeah, it was a guy called Bob Painter who worked for IPC, and they were a huge concern. They were based on the south bank of the Thames in a building called Kingsreach Tower. And they had been looking, as I mentioned earlier, the big publishers had all been looking for a magazine that would sell to young men for a long time. And they had an active team of people, the youth group, IPC youth group, who were desperately looking for a magazine that would sell to young people. So this guy, Bob Painter, watched this show, not the something else show that I mentioned earlier, but another one called Sparks. So we appeared on Sparks, and all we did on Sparks, without getting drunk, we did a much better job of describing what VIZ was, talking about the success we'd had. We did it in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek way. We all dressed in white coats, as if it was a sort of a scientific product, and we walked into the publishers like in step with each other in these white coats, like a bit like sort of Devo type thing, But apart from that, we just talked about the fact that we'd been producing and selling this magazine from our home for a number of years, and it was a great success locally and was beginning to sell nationally. And this guy, Bob Painter, was watching this show, and he went, oh my God, here's a magazine, a ready-made magazine that sells. I mean, and we mentioned this in the show. Our audience was almost all young men, aged 16 to 24. And these were the exact people that they couldn't sell one magazine to save their lives.
But
So-
he clearly didn't have his finger on the pulse if he hadn't come across it until he saw it on the BBC.
Well, yeah, but I mean, he was a guy probably in his 40s living in the commuter belt around London,
Right.
commuting in. And I mean, there was no internet in those days. So how you found out about it, if he wasn't literally going into Rough Trade Records or, the Bristol University Students' Union shop, he wasn't going to find out about VIZ, So he became aware of us, and he managed to get hold of our telephone number, and he rang up and he said he would like to speak to us. He said this straight away, he'd like to speak to us about the possibility of becoming the publishers of VIZ, giving us a national publishing deal. And obviously this was incredible to us because, what had become a really good hobby had went on to become a nice little sideline.
Were you making a living at it at this point?
No, we weren't funding our own living by the comic. We both had careers as this is me and Chris. Jim, by this time, Jim was the other guy, a school friend of ours who worked with us. He was a very peculiar guy, hugely talented, the most sort of gifted naturally cartoonist, sort of comic cartoon artist rather than comic artist. I mean, there's a distinction there. He only really drew funny stuff, he simplistic, funny stuff, but he had such an ability with it that almost everything he ever drew was effortlessly funny. And I've only really ever come across one other person who was like that, and that was a guy who actually came along and almost literally filled Jim's boots. He was a guy called Davy Jones, who later produced some of the more remarkable stuff in VIZ, like Gilbert Ratchet, Tin Ribs, the Vibrating Bum-Faced Goats, all the really weird stuff, Diana Ross's Dog Shit Museum, and the Rotating Chin Men, and just all these. Yeah. Anyway, Jim was the person who preceded that area of comedy in VIZ. He did Paul Wicker, the Tall Vicar, and he used to do stuff like he did strips that didn't really work on any level that you could explain, and yet they were brilliantly funny. Yeah. He did this thing called Billy Bear Says, "Watch out for rays from space." And it was just so funny, right? So anyway,
is that how you tended to work, kind of individually? And you'd come along and go, right, I've got this.
In those early days, we worked entirely independently of each other. We just wrote and drew our own strips. It wasn't until later that we consciously ever wrote stuff together. We did create in this business that began with Bob Painter, seeing the TV show. That led to, it's a bit like, it used to be so difficult to explain this to people, what the process was like. But now it's easy to say it was like The Apprentice on the telly, right? So we were effectively given a sort of a year-long job interview.
Right.
So we had to produce material and eventually a comic that was just for the purpose of them to look at and say, okay, maybe we'll give you the job, sort of thing. Right. So we produced a comic, and by this time, Jim was starting to, he kind of, as I said, he was a little bit of a Syd Barrett in more ways than one, in that he was one of the real original creative forces behind VIZ, and yet his mentality was not engaged in the process. You know, he sort of, he came in and out of it. He was a lovely guy, but he's one of the best friends I ever had. But he was difficult to understand, often difficult to see why he had all this talent but didn't utilize it. I mean, he did to an extent, but he was never committed to it like the way that we were. And so he had begun to, and it looks so funny looking back now, he'd begun to take a sensible career path. And he had worked with me when we first left school. We worked, don't tell them that, but we used to work as decorators, we used to do painting and decorating jobs. We used to work on sites doing mainly just decorating in those early days. And he'd gone down that route. He'd started to work with a property developer, and he was wanting to get into property development, interior design, that side of things. And he eventually moved away. He moved away to Cardiff, and he died a few years ago, sadly. He had heart problems. But he just didn't really want to get involved in the process. But he did to an extent. He was still at that time the only person that me and Chris could work with. He was the only person we'd ever worked with on this, these silly cartoons with swearing in. And IPC said, we want to meet you. They paid for us to get the train down to London, but they said, we're going to send you the money for first class tickets. You don't have to buy first class tickets, boys. I said this quite openly on the phone, So we pocketed and there was a lot of, we ended up buying second class saver tickets and pocketing all this money, which was, it was hundreds of pounds at the time as well, which was a fortune. And so they met us. When I say they, Bob Painter met us initially at the reception of this building, this huge tower on the south bank of the Thames. And he took us around the offices of IPC, and he showed us these rooms where there was one guy in his 80s was still working as a comic artist. And he was out on his lunch at the time, but he showed us his work. And he showed us that this guy when he drew a lorry, he still drew a lorry with an open cab, because when he was a kid, that was what lorries looked like, And he said, I'll never forget his words. He said to us that day, don't tell yourselves that there isn't a career in what you do.
Right.
And he almost said there and then, even if this doesn't work out, this idea of you working with working with us to produce, whatever it may be, what you do is and can be a job.
Yeah.
And that was the first time we realized, this really is going places,
Right.
So he then took us upstairs to meet the youth group who were in the river room, which was this room at the very top of this tower on the south bank, and it overlooked the whole of the River Thames. And there were all, ironically, there were all these guys in suits with grey hair, And the three of us sat across this giant oak table from them. And right in the middle was this guy called John Sanders, who was the head of IPC Magazine's youth group.
You wonder what qualified them to be in the youth group.
Well, yeah, it all came to be apparent what their. I mean, it should have.
Credentials were.
Well, yeah, it was. So the funny thing happened was, the first thing he said to us, and they had a butler. I mean, honestly, they had this guy, in tails and that, who there was a drinks cabinet that he rolled out, you know, so he opened the doors, would you like a drink, you know? It was mental. Anyway, they then served us lunch, and for lunch, it was shepherd's pie. And they'd obviously served the shepherd's pie because it was northern, you know, they thought we would like that, you know? And so this Sanders guy looks at the three of us sitting across the table from him, puts his knife and fork down, and he looks at us and says, so, you chaps are from Newcastle? And we said, yeah. And he said, I know a comedian from round your way. And we went, really? He says, yes, Bobby Thompson.
All right.
I says, oh, you know Bobby Thompson? He says, well, I know of him.
Right.
I said, oh, right.
And probably didn't understand a word he said.
Well, the thing was, he said at that point, you know, he sort of introduced the idea that he knows Bobby Thompson, and then it turns out he knows of him. So I assumed, he's a fan of Bobby Thompson. So I laughed and I said, I know a great Bobby Thompson joke. He says, do tell, right? So I said, it's my favourite joke. I said, he takes a packet of cigarettes out of his pocket. It's a packet of 10. And he takes one out. Oh, yeah. And before he puts it in his mouth, he looks at the packet and he says, you know, I bought this packet of tabs in 1948. I've only got 3 left. They greed them off you, right? And Jim, who's sitting right next to us, bursts out laughing. And Chris laughs. Sanders laughs. And all of his yes men either side of him start laughing when he starts laughing, you know. And the laughter dies down. And he puts his knife and fork down again and he says, so, he bought this packet of cigarettes in 1948. I said, yeah. He says, and he's only got 3 left. I said, yeah. He said, why is that? And I looked at him and I said, well, because they greed them off. You know? And he looked sort of blankly, you know. And I said, well, you know, it's like 30 years on and he thinks having 3 left. He thinks that's not, he should have more left than 3, you know. And he says, right. And at that point, it should really have been apparent to us, and I guess to an extent it was, that these were not the people to look after our interests in the world of publishing. Yeah. But the process went on for the best part of a year, with us producing work to, you know, we had to kind of demonstrate that we could produce a magazine that they were happy to publish. And Bob Painter, who was the guy who we continually dealt with on a face-to-face basis, he kept saying, don't worry, you've got to produce something that they will tick a box on, but then it'll be okay. You'll be able to do the thing that you want to do. Yeah. Just as long as they've ticked the box, that's the important thing, you know. And this Sanders guy, every time we produced something, you're producing like a dummy comic, you know, as if you were going to go to press. But instead of going to press, it goes to them and they look at it. And he was very disappointed that it wasn't political enough, you know. Okay. And we kind of said, but you see, the thing is, yes, young people have political convictions. But the thing with politics for humor is it's you know, it's very easy targets, you know. It's like you're either on one side of the political divide or you're on the other. And it's limiting in who you're appealing to. What we produce is something that is relief from all of the fucking strife that people go through in life, you know. I mean, I guess we weren't clever enough to word it that way. But, you know, we kind of said, however, we just do funny stuff, you know, that's the, you know. Anyway, they didn't get that. They wanted us to do politics. We kind of said, well, we don't do overt politics. We don't do party politics.
Yeah.
We will do stuff that has a political message, but once again, this wasn't something that we had the ability to say at the time. It's only now that I'm entering my 60s and I'm able to look back on all this stuff with the wisdom of the years. I'm able to sort of reflect on it and see it. But at the time, we knew that he was wrong. We knew that he was wrong to try and change what we did. Now, where the joy of this happens is, they did some other tragic stuff as well, by the way. They kept editing our work, and nobody had ever touched our work before. Our work went from our bedroom to the printing press to the pub where we sold it. That was all we knew. And they changed. So they changed Sid the Sexist to Sid the Smooth Talker. And I says, but hold on. We've got to be open about the fact that this is a big deal. The guy is a sexist, right?
That's kind of the point of the whole thing.
That's the deal, Yeah, anyway. Oh. But this just went on and on and on. It was like banging our heads off a wall, I remember they used to put things in as well that we hadn't done.
Really?
And one of the things they put in was a guardsman. It was a photograph of a guardsman outside Buckingham Palace with a handbag over his arm. And it said, "The changing of the guard." That was it. And we went, So anyway, this went on and on and on. And eventually we got a letter from Bob Painter saying, look, they're just shutting the door on this. It's not going to work, And we said, well, kind of sad, because we were, from that moment when they showed interest in us, that was where we saw this thing being a career.
Yeah.
And when they shut the door on us, it was for a moment at least a very chilling sort of, that's the end of it. It's not going to happen. And we thought, well, hold on, where do we go from here? Do we just have to continue producing this whilst we're trying to earn our living out of painting and decorating? And, we were doing illustrations. Chris was working, doing a lot of graphic art. I was we were illustrating cartoons for international newspapers and stuff, just bits of work from everywhere, much as my mum had always done, just doing whatever she could.
But it sounds like if it had been a career with that organisation, it would have been the kind of career that you really wouldn't want.
Oh yeah, we would have been a pain in their arses, and I think they knew that. We would have constantly been rebelling, and it would have been a fight. Every issue would have been a fight. Anyway, the joy of it at that point. There was this moment where it was horrible. We thought it was. I remember going to my girlfriend at the time and saying they've decided they're not going with us, and it was like, where do we go from here? And then I had to make decisions. What am I going to do? And I actually determined at that point that I was going to follow in my mum's footsteps and try and make wooden toys. But then, what happened was,
I'm just trying to imagine what sort of wooden toys.
Oh, I did make some. I initially began making models based on the ones my mum had made. So garages, just like wooden garages. She did forts. I did garages initially. And what else did I do? Those jigsaw pieces where, your kid's name in a jigsaw. And I then, through friends, I got jobs like making replacement parts for council playgroups and stuff for their wooden toys and stuff. And what happened, Painter, when he signed us off as a lost cause, his final goodbye to us, he said, listen, I'm sorry this hasn't worked out. We're sending you some money. as
Right.
a thank you for working for us effectively for a year without any reward. They sent us money. I went out and bought a stereo hi-fi with that money, which I've still got. Takes pride of place in my home, because it was that was the first money that I ever earned from VIZ. You know,
Right.
so he put a footnote on the letter that he sent. The letter was all typed. You know, this IPC was a big business, and in those days you had a typing pool. The letter would go off dictated to a typing pool. They would type it out, be sent back to his office to be signed.
Yeah.
And when he'd signed it, he'd scribbled by hand on the bottom of it, P.S. Why don't you try Richard Branson?
All right.
So my brother received this letter and he thought, oh, that's not a bad idea. So he wrote a letter to Richard Branson. I don't think Branson himself ever saw it, but he wrote a letter to Richard Branson saying, we sell, you know, explained who we were, and closed a copy of the comic. We sell 1,000 copies of every issue of our magazine in your Newcastle Virgin store. If you were to have it on sale in every one of your 32 Virgin stores, that would potentially be 32,000 sales per issue, which I imagine would be a profitable business for yourselves, you know. Would you be interested in looking into the idea of doing a publishing deal? And it, as I say, probably never got to Branson, but what did happen, it was forwarded to the head of Virgin Publishing, who was a guy, well, Virgin Vision, actually, they were called. Virgin Publishing was a very small wing of Virgin Vision. Virgin Vision was videotapes and stuff, you know, which were a burgeoning thing at the time, you know. But they did do magazines. They did like the Virgin In-Flight magazine, because Virgin Airlines had just been launched. And they didn't really do magazines. They did books, you know. They did books of coffee table books, you know. But they didn't do magazines. But it turns out John Brown, on whose desk this letter arrives with the copy of the comic, had seen us on the Sparks program.
TV program.
So him and the guy from IPC, Painter, had both coincidentally watched the same program. Painter's job was to try to find a magazine for 16 to 24-year-old men. So he dived straight in. But John Brown, it wasn't until he got this letter and it was suggested that he might want to be the publisher of this comic, never occurred to him that he could publish magazines.
Right.
And he sort of went, oh, hold on, there's an idea. He'd seen us on the program and been fascinated. So he immediately booked himself to come up and visit us. He flew up and he jumped in a taxi at the airport and said, driver, take me to Lily Crescent. And the driver said, where's that? And he said, Jesmond. And the taxi driver said, where's that? And he said, Newcastle. And he said, all right. He said, I'll tell you what, mate, I'll take you to the station. You've flown to Teesside. So he had flown to the wrong airport, but he came up and we went and had lunch with him in a local cafe, just up the road from, it was actually in between. The house where we were born was only about 300 yards from the house where we lived, and this cafe was in the middle between the two houses. So the house where we were doing VIZ was just up the road from this cafe, and we went for lunch in this cafe. And John, who's very posh, sort of public school, unlike anyone we'd ever really met before, just fired loads and loads of questions at us. That was all he did, was ask questions. How often do you produce it? How many people are involved in producing it? How much does it cost to produce? Where do you sell it? Yeah. How much do the people who sell it take from you? Bang, bang, bang. Then the one thing he said that wasn't a question was the thing that absolutely changed our lives. And I just remember me and Chris at this moment just looked at each other across the table. You know, it was a real moment. If this was a film, you know, it would be like that moment, the Spielberg lens moment, you know. So he looked at us and he just said, well, one thing I do realize is that if I was to give you a publishing deal, the one thing that I would absolutely have to do is not interfere in anything that you do. And he then stuck to that promise, and he wrote us a publishing contract which gave us total editorial control. Right. Now, no publisher in their right mind would do that.
Especially with you guys.
Well, this is the thing, but he could have given us a normal publishing contract and just given us his word that he wouldn't interfere. But what really was an absolute gift to us was that he knew that the success of the magazine would be dependent on these young minds doing what young minds thought needed to be produced, you know.
Just on a bigger scale.
Yeah. So basically he was just going to make it available nationally. Now, where that really came into its own was not only in his time as the publisher of VIZ, which obviously was, you know, a couple of years later, he actually set up his own company and he took the VIZ contract with him. Where this real gift that John gave us of a totally the gift that he gave us, this freedom to produce whatever we wanted without interference from the publisher. It went on not only to be a huge success for us in that we could produce whatever we wanted in the comic in that time when he was in charge at Virgin. He then took it on to set up his own company 2 years later. And during that time with Virgin and then John Brown Publishing, that was when we went from being this tiny independent to being like a hugely successful national publication. We were actually, you know, by the end of that period, we were outselling every magazine in British newsagents except the Radio Times and the TV Times. Yeah. And at that time, they couldn't publish each other's listings either. Yeah. That's a per issue sale. I mean, they were weekly, we were every 8 weeks, but per issue we were outselling them, or everything except them. But so when VIZ's contract was then sold on to other publishers, it's been in the hands of maybe half a dozen publishers now through the years. That is still set in stone. The contract is still the original contract that says that the publisher will have no say over the content of the magazine. And that has allowed VIZ that editorial freedom that it would never have had. And that all just goes back to that one, I mean, in my head, it goes back to that one moment in Willow Tea Room in Newcastle where John Brown said, I'm going to give you a contract and I'm not going to have any say in what you do, you know. And the only thing that he really wanted was to produce the magazine in order to show off to his friends in high society and to sell advertising. Yeah. And at that time, in those early years, with him, we continued the policy that we would design your adverts, but we had to then start to make compromises, in that some big advertisers wanted to come in and do then. But we did have some great saving graces. So, for instance, Keith, who ran the HMV shop in Newcastle, Keith Armstrong, he wanted to advertise in VIZ because the Virgin shop, the local Virgin shop, were allowed to do so. And the local Virgin shop were allowed to stock VIZ. Mm-hmm. He wasn't allowed to stock VIZ because everything that he stocked had to be agreed by head office. Right. So what he did was he stocked VIZ without permission of his head office. And in order to allow his staff the opportunity to hide VIZ, if anyone from head office came into the building, he put them right by the tills where the staff could grab them and put them under and it was the most important place in the shop to put something like a magazine, So, but he also bought advertising, and we were able, it wasn't strictly legitimate, I'm sure, but he bought adverts in VIZ which were done in the style of the national HMV adverts, but
not quite the same.
Where? So the HMV shop Northumberland Street, only shop elsewhere. I mean, I was going to say you wouldn't get away with that nowadays. Well, you wouldn't have got away with it at the time either, but we somehow managed. I mean, he was flying by the seat of his pants, Not surprisingly, really, he set up as an entrepreneur in his own rights thereafter. And, he was the founder with others of Kitchenware Records, But yeah, they were fascinating times, It was, I think I said at the very start when we started talking, I said that, one of the lessons that I've learned about success is you need your skill, you need your commitment, you need your work ethic, but more than anything, you need that luck. And that, the fact that Bob Painter and John Brown were both watching that TV program, that was the luck.
Could be very different, couldn't it?
Yeah. And also the fact that John Brown actually gave us a written agreement that he wouldn't interfere in the content of the magazine. He didn't need to do that. He could have protected himself by giving us an agreement, but not in writing on that particular fact. But the fact that he did that is what allowed VIZ to be as irreverent, continue to be as irreverent and as two fingers to everything as it always was. And that was obviously what made it appeal to the younger market. That, I mean, obviously it wasn't entirely men at the time, but it was selling to the people that other magazine producers could not sell to. Well, that was the big factor for them. And it was really that success was born not only out of what we were creating, but out of the fact that he allowed that freedom to carry on. Effectively, the product didn't change from the moment we actually signed the deal and became a national publication.
And I guess in some ways, sadly, VIZ was one of the, not quite the last, but among the last big titles in magazine publishing before it started to decline. Yeah,
I think we're all aware now that magazines are really a thing of the past in terms of mass interest. Sales of all magazines have become less and less as the internet has taken over how we enjoy everything in entertainment, really. But we were certainly one of the last trends, I guess you might say, in publishing. I think we, not deliberately or with any sort of interest particularly, but we did open the door for that sort of late 90s, or when did it happen? I don't know. Men's Lads Mag show, that came along. And a lot of people put us in this later have attempted in various things to put us in the same bracket as that, but that was all.
Yeah.
Lads,
You're in a bracket of your own.
No interest in any of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was just. It always irritated us that people came along to work for publishers who took on our contract later, who didn't understand that that we didn't want to be associated with any of that, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think VIZ was and still is unique. I mean, it's still, me and my brother stopped working. Yeah, Chris worked on VIZ for 20 years, and I worked on it for a further 4. And we left it in the hands of the 2 guys who came in to replace Jim Brownlow. Really, Jim, who was the founder, who, like I say, went off initially to work in property development, and then moved to Cardiff.
So you left it in good hands.
Well, yeah. What happened was we had 2 guys. One guy came along in 1984, just around the time when we were trying to get this deal together with IPC, the one that never came through. And his partner at the time was at Newcastle University, and she saw VIZ for sale there, and she looked at it and thought, "Oh, this looks like that stuff that my boyfriend does." And she gave it to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, no." And he arranged to meet us, and he came up. He was kind of pushed into it by her in a way, you know. And he just turned up, and he had a book of sketches, and he hadn't done a cartoon for print before. He just did doodles. Effectively, he turned up with a book full of doodles. But he was very talented, you know. And he said, "Well, what should I do with them?" And we said, "Well, look at what we do. I mean, this is what we looked at the comics that we read, and that was how we became comic artists and writers. So maybe look at what we produce.
Right.
Can you in some way copy that and you know,
take it on?
Do something of your own in that format."
Yeah.
And that was what he did straight away. You know, within a few weeks, he'd produced a strip called Victor and his Boa Constrictor. So
he clearly got it.
I got it straight away, yeah. So we started to work with him, Graham, Jury. And then when we actually got the deal with John Brown to work for Virgin, Chris went into a little bit of a panic, because we thought, hold on, we've got a publishing deal. We're going to actually have to produce the magazine regularly, which we hadn't previously done.
Right.
Up to that point, we'd just produced it when we had one ready. It was like a band making an album, you know. You put it together when you could.
Yeah.
We put it out there, and we kind of tried to give ourselves deadlines, but it didn't always work. So sometimes they came out every 3 months. Sometimes there was a year between 1983 to 84. There was a whole year between 2 new issues, you know. But we were going to have to produce it every 8 weeks. So we were desperate in this sort of this new world of deadlines that we found ourselves in. How are we going to have enough work? So he put an advert in Private Eye, and it said, "Bum rates paid by National Magazine for funny cartoons," and that was all it said. And we got one response, and it was this guy who, to this day, is running VIZ, Simon Thorpe. So Simon Thorpe and Graham Jury, they're the 2 guys who picked up the baton and ran with it. After
it was a test of who was the right person,
who would respond to this. Yeah. So and what happened when in 1988 between So Graham came in 84, Thorpe came in 85, and they contributed by post
Right.
up until we moved into an office for the first time. We moved out of our parents' home. We moved the office into a proper office space. And they came to work with us.
Right.
And at that point, we had a writing room and we began to write as a team.
Right.
And it was in that period when we began to write as a four-man team. That was when we really began to produce that was when VIZ had its massive spell of so I mean, we broke record after record. Every issue was breaking record sales, you know. And it was that was late 80s, early 90s, you know. VIZ went from, I remember when we first went in the office, not long afterwards, we got the news that we'd broken through the 500,000 sales record. Wow. And we had a packet of fig rolls to celebrate that. Yeah, wow. Yeah. And the next issue was like 750,000, or the next figure, the sales figures I think came out every 3 to 6 months, I can't remember. ABC sales figures. And the next one was 750,000, and the next one was over 1 million. And it was just absolutely crazy. And so we continued doing that for, well, like I say, Chris continued with us until 99. And then I continued right through until Christmas of 2013, by which time we'd picked up the guy who I mentioned earlier, David Jones, who was a Welshman who was actually born in Newton Aycliffe, but grew up in Wales. And he'd been contributing since about 85, 86 by post. And he came up to join us when we moved to another office just a couple of streets away. He came to work with us full time, and he still works for VIZ now. He's one of the sort of the stalwarts. Like I say, he's the guy who does that really weird stuff, the rotating chin men and all that, you know. But he was then later joined by, we used to get a lot of people would get in touch with us. We used to get contributions, unsolicited contributions sent to us, and they would bags full of them, you know. They were coming in daily when we were selling in the millions, and they were awful, you know. Almost every single one of them was absolutely awful. And we used to dread the day we would go through a bag full of them, you know, and send them all these forms out saying we're not interested, you know. But one day somebody said, there's this kid at our school who seems to be very talented. Do you do work experience? Mm-hmm. And we kind of went, well, no, not really. But
it's not really a suitable environment for it.
But they had enclosed some of his work.
Right.
And what we encountered was a young kid who had grown up reading VIZ. Mm. So he had done that thing that we'd kind of told Graham to do, like taking VIZ and using it as a basis to create stuff. But he'd done it quite naturally. He just started reading the comic, wanted to write and draw cartoons. And he was just good at it, you know? So he did this thing that all of these contributions that we used to sift through day after day, he, at the age of 15, had not only the talent as an artist, but his stories had a beginning and a middle and an end and a punchline ending. And it was, you know, and they had sort of pulled back the reveals, that they had all these sort of great tricks of writing.
He's almost fully formed.
Oh, yeah.
Stage. Yeah.
And we said, oh, well, let's get him in. And he came in to work on, as a T-boy, effectively, sort of thing, for a couple of weeks, whatever it is, as a however work experience. You know, it's basically just to tick a box for the school to say he's been somewhere. But he had a great attitude. We really liked him. he was very mature in many ways for his age, but also extremely immature, which worked very well in our environment. Yeah. So we said to him, look, do you want to come in whenever we have a deadline? Do you want to come in and help us in the office, you know? So the first thing he started doing was he started working as a colouring artist for us. But then we realised it would be silly to waste his talent as an actual artist and writer. And over time, you know, he started coming up with his own ideas and drawing things. And then when he turned 18, we said to him, look, do what you want. Go away to university if you want to. If you don't want to, come here and work for us. Yeah. You can come, there's a job here for you if you want to come and work for us. If you want to go away to university, there'll be a job for you here at the end of university. But either way, there's a job here for you, you know. And he thought about it and he decided to come to us straight away. Right. And he, I don't know if he's still working for VIZ, but he was working for VIZ for at least 20 years or so. He's worked for VIZ until very recently, and now I don't know if he's still working for VIZ. I haven't seen him. He's a good friend of mine still. I haven't seen him for a few weeks. I know that he's basically so busy now that would be the only reason that he's not working for VIZ any longer, because he now writes for Mr. Bean, Danger Mouse, My Little Pony, and various other TV shows for kids that you would only have heard of if you were a kid or somebody with young kids, you know. But yeah, he's highly sought after in that business now. So it was obvious, as I say, when he was 15 that he had a natural talent for storytelling. Yeah.
So how does it? What does it feel like now when you pick up the latest edition of VIZ?
I avoid it. I honestly do. The thing was when me and Chris left, Chris was kind of living remotely. He lived rurally. He had young kids, and outside of work, we didn't see a lot of him. I mean, you know, I think when you work with somebody day in, day out for a long time, sibling or otherwise, it becomes, you don't want to see too much of one another, you know. And we see a lot more of each other now than we ever did when we were working together. But that's taken time, you know. It's short, you know, sort of straight after we stopped working on VIZ, we still didn't see each other for a long time, but now it's gradually come back. And we now do see each other, and we even work on stuff together again. You know, we do sort of, we write some comedy stuff together. We do sort of bus tour gigs where we talk about the beginnings of our careers, you know, and we sort of do this thing. There's a company called Tyne Idols who run a bus, and they do sort of film set tours and music tours. And they got in touch with us one day, and do you want to do a comedy sort of history of Newcastle tour, you know? And we ended up actually just doing a tour where we go around and talk about all the places where we sold VIZ, where VIZ was sold, where people lived who we based characters on and things like that, you know, the houses where we were born, the house where we, you know, where VIZ was based for all those years, some of the offices. I mean, a lot of the buildings are gone now, you know, but we go and look at the vacant spaces, you know.
That must feel quite strange, though, that you're kind of almost doing a VIZ, well, as you say,
a nostalgia tour. Yeah, heritage tour. Yeah, but the thing is, we do still create stuff together. Yeah. Before the pandemic, we were doing a monthly show at the Stand Comedy Club in Newcastle called Donald Trump's, in which So we were the Donalds, and we were trying to trump each other. It was like a game of trumps.
Right.
So basically, he wrote my questions and I wrote his questions, and I had no idea what his were. He had no idea what mine were. And it was hosted by Alfie Joey, and Alfie read the questions out.
Right.
And it was great fun. And I'm hoping to, the most popular round was it was called Soul Brothers, but it was based on Mr. and Mrs.
Okay.
So it was like you wrote a question and he had to guess the correct answer, and
You had to match the guess.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
We've all seen Mr. and Mrs. Sure.
Mr. and Mrs. be nice to each other. But then it was that was great fun, because that was the round where we wrote a piece
Right.
of all new stuff, and we're hoping to relaunch that again soon as part of a show that I'm going to set up because I've worked now as a stand-up comic for coming up to 20 years.
Right.
And I'm doing I'm celebrating that fact that I'm coming up to 20 years. September of 25 is 20 years in stand-up. So I'm doing a big show at the Tyne Theatre in Newcastle to celebrate that. And I'm in the lead up to it, I'm going to set up my own stand-up gig in the year leading up to it. And during that time, I'm intending to work up the material that I'm going to do in my theatre show. But at the same time, I've got this idea that in the middle section, me and Chris are going to do that Mr. and Mrs. set again. Where we, and then maybe we'll do it as a section in the theatre show as well if it works.
So where can people see you between now and September?
Well, I work all around the country doing stand-up, but mainly in the northeast of England. Since the pandemic and since the energy crisis, and travelling further away to gigs has become less and less economically viable. So what happens now is comedians are becoming a bit more localised now.
Right.
But that's not really a negative, because it's actually, especially in the northeast here, it's formed like a real a vibrant scene. It means that well, in Newcastle, for instance, there's a setup called Felton Out, which is a non-profit organisation set up by local comedians, and they basically set up their own gigs, and they're available as a sort of an agency for booking gigs in for anyone. If anyone's got an event, they can book an act. Or a series of acts, or they can just book a comedy night, and they put on gigs all over the northeast of England. So that actually has become a really good source of working locally, and you're getting out and about and doing gigs. So I do a lot of work for them. There are other gigs locally, which obviously I do. I mean, the Stand in Newcastle is a great local comedy club. There are other agencies, Scrapper Reed, for instance, who put on gigs locally. So I do plenty of work for them, and I've got this theatre show coming up. So, I mean, my hope, I haven't actually spoken to the venue yet, but I'm hoping that the place where I'm going to do my shows leading up to the major theatre show, I'm hoping to do them in the room where we actually first sold VIZ.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
wow.
Which is actually the first place where Sting performed as well. Yeah.
Which is not quite as important, but still.
Yeah, whatever. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story about Sting. So I met him at a charity event a few years ago, and when I was introduced to him, Angie, the friend who introduced me, She works for Graham Wiley Foundation. She's somebody who I went to school with, known all my life. And she introduced me to Sting, and she said, "This is Simon. He was one of the founders of VIZ." And he went, "Oh, VIZ." And I went, yeah, VIZ. I says, "Nice to meet you." He says, "I've got everything you've ever written about us on my toilet wall," right? And at that point, this image flashed before my eyes. Because in that game I was telling you, Donald Trump's, one of the things that we used to do was we used to do a headlines round where we would put stuff up, blank bits out, and and we had to try to remember what it was that we had done in the past. Or sometimes they were just made up ones that, But one of them was, Chris had put this one up, and the reveal was it was a thing that he'd written about Sting in this many years ago. So Sting says, "Oh, I've got everything you've written about me on my toilet wall," and flashes up in my mind, 4-inch sex monkey IT says Sting. And I went, "Everything? We got everything?" And he says, yeah. And he seemed very enthusiastic about it. I says, "Wow." I says, "And what do people make of that?" He says, the Americans, they go in there, and they come out and they're ashen-faced, and they'll say, 'My God, what the hell is that?' He says, I say to them, 'It's VIZ, man.'" He says, and that's all he says. He says, "It's VIZ, man." He just leaves it at that.
All you need to do is explain it.
VIZ, man.
Well, hopefully, I'm sure we can put somewhere either in the comments or on the screen here details of what's coming up.
I think the tickets for that theatre show will be going on sale in September of 24, I think.
Right.
So it's going to be a lot of fun, I hope. And like I say, I want to sort of review my whole sort of stand-up career in the shows that I'm going to do leading up to it. And, find some of the best bits, talk about everything that I've done and experienced on 20 years on the road, you know what I mean? Right. It's
and as you say, if comedians are working more locally now, well, that just means that if people want to see Simon, you've got to travel to Newcastle, which is
also one of the first gigs I ever used to do was at the Royalty in Sunderland. I used to do that quite regularly.
Along the road from where we are now.
Yeah, that's right.
And having put Newcastle on the map in many respects, I think it's only fair that people are now coming to hear about it and maybe see some of the birthplace of.
Well, we have got the Metro. If anyone wants to come and visit Newcastle from Sunderland, we've got the Metro.
Finally.
No, we've always had it. It's you that didn't used to have it.
True. Well, Simon, thank you so much for this.
I'd like to say it's been a pleasure, and I would if it had been,
Simon, thank you.
Quite all right. Tea's cold now.
I've got to try and do an outro now with a serious face. I might wait till he's gone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. We certainly did. So do join us again for another edition of Northern Spotlights. It probably won't be as funny as this one, but it'll be just as inspiring, I'm sure.